left off talking about cognitive development, and we had one piece that we still needed to cover that we ran out of time with, and that was looking at some changes that take place in terms of intelligence. And we want to look at it in terms of what's referred to as fluid intelligence, and that begins to show some declines, and that's referred to or defined as basic capacity for learning. And that's kind of related to how quickly we process information, and that tends to slow some, related to memory processes. And I think a lot of it has to do with the kinds of activities that we're involved in. We talked earlier when we were looking at physical development, talked about physical exercise. And if we continue to do physical exercise in terms of aerobic and resistance training, then the declines physically are fairly minimal. It's the same way with mental. I think it's a lot to do with how we mentally exercise. And if we're involved in the nature of our work that involves thought processes and making decisions and processing lots of data, or jobs that may require us to have relatively good memories, where we have to remember lots of facts or remember names and faces and numbers, then those declines are going to be considerably less. If we tend to move in roles or jobs or activities that don't require a lot of mental processes, then we may show some slightly greater declines. The other type of intelligence, which we refer to as crystallized intelligence, simply has to do with learned knowledge, and our ability to gain new knowledge continues to increase. And so we're continually learning new information as we move through the course of our lives. But the speed and the rate at which maybe we process some of that information may show some slight declines. And here, and what we'll see is that will tend to be a pattern, from this point on. Dark line at the top representing crystallized intelligence, and what you see is that continues to improve right on up through later adulthood. And when we get to later adulthood, we'll talk about how older adults are still very capable of learning. Just how they learn and how they process information is different. But to continue to gain knowledge, that happens throughout most of our lives. The fluid intelligence, what you can see, and I think a lot of that probably has to do with simply the experiences and exposure we've had to those activities that promote and stimulate those processes. And so up until the time we hit young adulthood, we're in learning environments that are forcing us to process information, to remember information, to reflect back that which we've learned. And when we get into young adulthood, we tend to be engaged in fewer activities that may require those processes. So again, here you see with early young adulthood is where we begin to start to see those declines. And they tend to slightly drop off as we move through middle adulthood and in through late adulthood. All right. Where we want to spend most of our attention today and in our next session is looking at really what we're going to do is combine emotional development with social development for young adulthood. Again, looking at Erikson's stages. Anyone remember, again, without looking at your notes, what adolescence was? Because, again, it's important you get that really kind of set in your mind and know it pretty automatic. Adolescence was all about the formation of identity. Excellent. And, again, it was identity versus role confusion. Here in young adulthood, Erikson's stage refers to intimacy versus isolation. And I think what Erikson would say is the challenge is that young adults need to form additional new intimate relationships, because part of what's happening is the adolescent, as they move into young adulthood, has begun to make a break away from their centrally intimate relationships, i.e. their families of origin. And friendships still remain important, though new friendships may be formed. But as they begin to kind of make that physical separation for family, and again, it doesn't mean that family members aren't significant, they aren't important, and they will always make up an important part of the support network. But what tends to happen for most young adults, that those needs for connectedness, where most of those needs for intimacy and closeness to others tend to not to be fulfilled somewhat differently as they begin to form some new relationships. And what we want to focus on is that for the vast majority, that will be in the form of committed, more intimate marriage or cohabiting relationships. And the significance of those, of which then out of many of those will be another form of intimate relationship, very significant, and that is that transition in becoming parents and the relationship that gets formed between parent and the child. And both of these experiences, for the majority of people, occur during the stage of young adulthood. And they tend to be the places where the greatest place where those intimacy needs are met and fulfilled. And again, it's not a statement that family doesn't continue to be important, but it's not the primary place where I think those needs get met, and clearly get met in different ways than would ever get met in the family. And so what we want to do, and again, what happens is as people begin to make that break, according to Erickson, and begin to move out on their own, if they don't develop significant relationships, again, continued friendships, but begin to form other relationships of some kind to meet those intimacy needs, then they could find themselves feeling isolated, and disconnected, And some may be able to maintain those needs, again, with family members, but the vast majority really do desire, if you look at surveys with college students, the vast majority clearly say, that my goal is to be in some type of romantic, intimate relationship of some kind. And for the majority of those, the hope is at some point to be in a marriage relationship. And for the vast majority of them is the hope that they will then also have children out of those relationships. And so what we want to do, very generally, very much an overview, is to take a look at marital relationships. And again, I teach another course on marriage and family relationships that we spend the whole semester addressing this issue, and we're going to do it all in about 40 minutes. So very much kind of skimming the top. But I think it's significant to look at an overview of this topic simply because it's such a significant part of the young adult stage. Real quickly, looking at marriage, just some of the demographics. And for many of you, you probably know the statistics. But the majority, in fact, somewhere between 85-90% of Americans will get married at some point in time in their lives. So again, when we talk about majority, we're not talking just simple majority. We're talking, an extremely high percentage of Americans. And most of those will do that during the stage of young adulthood. So it clearly is one of the goals, one of the aspirations for Americans. Most of the research that you read will still say that 50% of first marriages, those that are currently married, are estimated to end in divorce. And again, I think probably in the next 10 years we're going to see some of those statistics shift, and hopefully we'll begin to see the divorce rate. It's clearly stabilized over the last decade or two, or at least decade and a half, and we're yet to see whether that stabilization will begin to show a trend or at least a movement in the other direction. But still, most estimates will say that roughly about 50%. And I think what we will find is, and I haven't seen a lot of the statistics on the upper end, we clearly know that the younger you marry, as you go down the other direction, the risk of divorce goes up. And my guess is that we see that the later, clearly that if we marry right around the median age, and we'll look at that in a moment, tends to be the places where are most successful. And we probably can go above that. I think one of the issues is what about for those who wait till they're 40 or 45 and marry for the first time? And what we might say is that it may be more of a curvilinear relationship, that if we wait much later in life, that we may start to see that to start to go the other direction because we get so set in your ways and patterns that it may be harder to make adjustments. But we don't see a lot of statistics, or I haven't read a lot on that upper end. Part of that is because, where we're seeing most of those first marriages occurring, again, are right around that median age, and that's where we tend to focus our attention. And there's no question, younger, risk goes up. And again, one of the things, part of that, I think you're exactly right, I think part of the stabilizing is because of those completing education and continuing education, that we're more likely to marry later. And for a lot of reasons, that tends to be conducive to more successful relationships. I think some of that is just simply being more prepared to make that transition of life. Not only emotionally, but also financially, more established in careers. By the time we're more ready to start careers and establish them than if I get married when I'm 17 or 18. I think we're more set also on some of the things that we've talked about in terms of more sure about who we are, what are the things that are important to us. I think we're more socially mature. I think we live out some of that. I think we get more to 25 and 27, we're more ready to say, I'm ready to kind of settle down and make a commitment than when we're real young and we're still kind of maybe still wanting to live out some of the single life. So I think there's a lot of things, and you're right on target there. The majority of those who divorce will remarry. You know, what we find is about 75% of those who divorce will remarry. You don't need to know this for the test, but the majority of them will do that within 3 years. So again, part of the statement is, and I think what people need to understand, is in spite of the fact that, you know, there have been a lot of attacks on marriage, a lot of criticism of marriage, you know, people strive and want to be married. And even the result of divorce doesn't deter people from wanting to be married again. You know, I think the struggle is for people to figure out how to do it that's successful. And I think that's our challenge as a society, is to help couples be prepared to achieve the goals and aspirations and the hopes that they have for those relationships. And we don't do a good job of preparing people for marriage or for significant relationship, whether it's legal marriages or not. And what we find is, unfortunately, that those who remarry, 50% or better will divorce again. So the divorce rate is actually higher for remarriages than it is even for first marriages. And here, we won't spend a lot of time talking about that. In other classes, we would cover some of the reasons why that is. Which we've just already kind of discussed a little bit or mentioned. People are postponing marriage. This trend has kind of been going up for the last couple of decades. We have the median age for males being 27 and for females being 25. So again, it's right in the mid-20s, upper mid-20s. And again, not surprisingly, you see a 2 years difference. If you go back to when we were talking about adolescence and talking about the transition you know, into adolescence and the progression through puberty, one of the things that we talked about is that females tend to mature a couple of years earlier than males. And so it's not surprising. And what we tend to find is it's not uncommon for a female, when they do marry, to marry a male that is right around their age or just slightly older, which puts them where? Pretty much in the same, on the pretty much the same level in terms of the development. So that's not a big surprise. And clearly we find that the success rates are associated, related to when we marry. The couples who marry closer or even a little bit above the median age, more likely for marital success than those that are younger. You've seen this in your reading. You'll continue to see it in your reading as we move and talk about middle adulthood and late adulthood a little bit later on in the semester. But statistically what we find is married people are healthier and happier than single people. And again, particularly in those married relationships that would be considered successful. High quality. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. And so clearly, not only in terms of intimacy needs, though there's probably a relationship to that, it's clearly related to other parts of our mental health, physical health as well, and there clearly have found to be advantages to marriage. And again, that'll come back up again later on in the semester. And again, I think it shows us the relationship and the importance of intimacy and those needs being met, to not just only that social part of our lives, but how it ties to our emotional lives, mental, and even to some extent has physical relationships as well. Again, we talk about a high percentage desire to be married, and again, most of them want to have successful marriages. And so within the study of marriage and family relationships, when we talk about success, we often define it in two terms. We talk about it in terms of stability, and again, you may want to underline or highlight those key words. And then we also talk about it in terms of satisfaction. Now, stability simply means what? Any ideas? If we talk about a marriage being stable, any thoughts about what that means? We talk about, we see couples getting introduced. You know, you go to a variety of different places, and we say, or on the TV show programs, in the early morning shows, and they say we're going to honor, or celebrate so-and-so's wedding anniversary. And so they have been married 40 years. And so we would say that relationship is relatively successful. And we would say it's successful based on stability, meaning what? Duration. When we talk about stability of a relationship, we're simply talking about duration. They've been married a long time. And if they've been married 40 years, they're most likely going to continue to be married until one of them passes away for the most part. And so we often talk about it. And so most people would, without a doubt, say that those couples that have been married 50 years are very successful. However, I think in the field we would say that that's not the whole story. That we don't only hope that couples stay married for a long period of time, but also what we hope is that they have a high level of satisfaction. And so we really are looking at both of those characteristics. How happy am I with my marriage relationship? How happy am I with my partner? To what extent does this relationship meet certain needs in my life, that I find gratifying? And that's the satisfaction part. Because the reality is, and my guess is you all probably know someone, they've been married 25, 30, 40 years, but they are what? They're not happy. Are they successful? They're successful to the extent that they've been stable. Are they successful in the sense that it's brought the satisfaction they desire? Not really. In fact, one of the things that the research would suggest is that not only do 50% of first marriages end in divorce, but much of the research would suggest that the 50% of those that stay married, only half of them are really happily married. Which means if that is true, that there's only about 25% of first marriages that reach the level of satisfaction that they desire and would like to have. It says we have a long way to go in terms of really helping prepare couples for satisfying, fully successful relationships. Now, again, if marital satisfaction is, and what we find is couples that are highly satisfied are less likely to divorce, and that logically that makes sense. And so if we can continue to increase satisfaction, we're most likely in most cases going to increase stability as well. And so what we want to do is simply identify very quickly some of the factors that contribute, and they're not the only ones, but these are the ones that most often will show up, have to do with marital satisfaction. Now, key word here, and you want to underline, highlight that word, and let's see if you can figure it out. Number of unresolved problems. What's the key word here? Unresolved. So underline, highlight that. A lot of times we tend to think that the issue with happy versus unhappy couples is the existence of problems. It's not the determining factor. All couples will experience difficulties and experience problems. The issue is what separates successful relationships from those that are less successful. What separates couples that tend to be happier and more satisfied than those that tend to be dissatisfied is the extent to which they can resolve the problems, the extent to which they can solve conflict in their relationships. Couples who can do that actually are drawn closer together. Couples who don't tend to find their relationships sometimes being pulled apart. And so the issue is unresolved problems. It's not the existence of problems. And having problems isn't a barometer of whether it's a good relationship or not. It's that ability to resolve those or not. How free time is spent. One of the real challenges for couples today, and regardless of where they are in terms of the longevity of their relationship, whether we're talking a new married couple or a couple that's been married 20 or more years, one of the factors in terms of satisfaction is how free time is spent together. And one of the things that couples are really struggling with, and families are struggling with today, is to be able to find enough time to spend together. You can't nurture, a good relationship, and for that relationship to continue to grow and continue to be healthy if you don't at least spend some time, how? Together. And one of the things that couples are really struggling with is finding quality time to spend together in order to maintain that level of intimacy that they had while they were dating and when made that choice to get married. And one of the things that happens for a lot of couples, is that after they've kind of gone through that honeymoon phase, they begin to settle into daily kind of routines and patterns, and without realizing it, without intentionally wanting it to happen, they find themselves drifting apart because they find such limited time that they're actually spending together, unlike probably during that period of time when they first fell in love, first started dating, where their whole world evolved around what? And only what? At that peak of each other. At the peak of the passion and the romance, when the only thing that seemed to matter or be important was each other. And the rest of the world, for the most part, was non-existent. And that's where my focus, and then all of a sudden what happens is we get married, and then all of a sudden the focus and energy begins to go towards what kinds of things? One of the main ones is jobs. It may get focused on friendships, or at least get divided with friendships, and then personal hobbies, and then all of a sudden lives get real fragmented. And particularly then when kids come along, they may become even more fragmented, And I've even known couples, where they even shared most of the same interests, and really enjoyed spending time together. But even some of the shared interests they had, they found that they were doing those activities separate and apart from each other, rather than together. And in most cases, what I discovered is that those relationships had ended. And they were looking back trying to figure out what happened, and all that people often say is, well, we drifted apart. Well, they drifted apart because we never spent very much time together. And it's easy for that to happen, though I don't think that it's often intentional. So again, how free time is spent. Couples who are intentional about planning time together, spending quality time together, tend to be more satisfied than those who just leave it up to chance. Again, a real challenge for couples is again related to the frequency and the quality of their sexual activity. One of the things that we know is that what the research will tell you is that the frequency of sexual activity doesn't have to, but statistically declines the longer a couple is married. Can you think of a couple of reasons why that might be? It doesn't have to, but it is what happens. And when the frequency of sexual activity declines, it tends to lower satisfaction for either one or both of the couples. Can you think of any reason why that would change? I know that's word sex, and so nobody's going to say anything. Go ahead, Ann. I think part of it is they kind of get used to each other and they settle into other routines. And again, like with other things, tend to not be real focused and real intentional. And one of the things I've heard more than once from couples, and someone said to me one time, that's just what happens to old married people. They just quit being focused on that part of their relationship, and they kind of get used to each other. And then pretty soon they realize, well, it's just not something that we do very often. But it doesn't mean that there's still not some dissatisfaction with that reality that many couples just tend to accept and see as a part of, unfortunately, being married.
Or if they're already spending less time together and drifting apart, why would they
Yeah.
necessarily have sex frequently?
Exactly, because one of the things we know is that, again, when emotional intimacy begins to decline, it tends to have a direct effect also on physical intimacy as well. And so if all of a sudden we find our lives going in different directions and we're not as emotional close, again, some of the desire, except those that maybe come out of the physical needs, tend to diminish. And so again, we tend to get focused on it. We're going to talk next time about this one, but there's one other major contributing factor, that children. And one of the things we find is that when children come into the picture, which naturally happens as the focus tends to move, particularly when children are really young, to that role of the transition of parenthood, into raising children, and the time and energy it takes tends to sometimes take away, from that. And again, it's like with leisure time. It's something I think couples have to be committed to and realize is an important part of their relationship. And again, I'm not talking about putting it on the calendar and scheduling it, but I think it's important that couples are really intentional of not ignoring that important part of their relationship. Otherwise, it could come back and be problematic somewhere down the road. And again, we'll diminish satisfaction. When satisfaction goes down, we put the relationship, at risk. Again, not as a big surprise, but the effectiveness of communication. And again, you can't solve conflict very well. You can't make good decisions if you can't communicate effectively. And if there's any one factor that probably universally will show up that really separates healthy relationships from unhealthy relationships is the effectiveness. And again, the key word here is effectiveness. It's not the issue whether couples do or don't communicate, it's how effectively they do that. Happier couples have more effective communication kinds of patterns. And finally, one of the big factors is what we call compatibility of role expectations. One of the things that happens, and in my other classes, I tend to use a couple of analogies that kind of illustrate this. Literally, when a couple falls in love and then they make that decision to marry or to make a more commitment to their relationship, i.e., to live together. And in many cases, the hope is to see whether that relationship, that we're compatible to whether we want that relationship to continue. And so the reality is that couples, again, come together, with great hopes of success for this relationship, often come with a high level of emotional intimacy, feeling really connected to their partner, and they begin to move towards what we call marital or at least relationship adjustment. And so part of the adjustment is learning how and seeing whether we're compatible. In real simple terms, compatibility in terms of a marital or cohabiting relationship is our ability to do what? Just in simple terms. If it's going to be compatible, it's our ability to, just general terms, simply fit and work together and to live together in harmony. And I think we tend to, and I think one of the things that we find is that newly married, new relationships actually tend to believe that this adjustment is going to be simple, easy. And they tend to believe that because, why? Most couples find the adjustment to the relationship a lot harder than they thought it was going to be. Why do couples enter relationships believing that it's going to be so easy? And it's kind of the myth of relationships.
Because they're in love, so it should just work itself out.
Sure. And again, don't get me wrong. Being in love is important, and that should be part of the energy that fuels them to be able to work it out. But they tend to believe that all that it takes to form a successful relationship is to be in love, and that love will see them through, and that love will solve all the problems. And then all of a sudden they begin to realize that it's not that simple. No matter how much they love each other, that the love for each other alone won't necessarily resolve the issues. I think the other thing that happens is couples often come together believing that we really won't have a lot of problems. Why? Not only because they're in love, but what do they tend to believe? And some of that's understandable. We fall in love, we decide to make this commitment, we're going to live together. That should be simple. Any thoughts about why we think it's so simple, besides the fact that we're so deeply, madly in love? Well, some of it clearly is a lack of experience. And most couples, by the time they make a decision to get married, actually believe that they are very similar, very much alike. So how could learning to live together be difficult? And then what begins to happen early on in the adjustment period is the couples start to gradually begin to learn that there are differences, sometimes very little differences, that they have that they never even thought about. Because a lot of couples really never talk about some of the most critical, major issues in their lives and in terms of their relationship. And they just assume that we're alike, that we're similar, or that if we have differences, they'll be easy to work out. And so the real challenge is to determine and to develop compatibility. Because each one brings to this marriage expectations. And they have expectations of what? Again, just in general. And they both have them. I get married and I bring into this relationship expectations of, what about my new spouse? My new loving wife? I have expectations about what role she's going to fulfill. There are certain things that I've learned in my life of what wives do. I have certain expectations about what my role as a husband is. And then likewise, my partner has similar expectations. And what do we tend to believe coming into that relationship about those expectations? Not only that our expectations are right, but they're shared. We really tend to believe that we share the same viewpoint about what wives do and what husbands do. Now, where for the most part do we learn those roles and those expectations? The family we grew up in. And so how money was managed, how division of labor was determined, those kinds of issues, how we spend time together, how we solve conflict, how we communicate with one another, those different expectations, those different patterns, for the most part, we learned in the families that we grew up in. And so basically, even without thinking about it, we get married and we assume that our partner shares very similar expectations. And so what happens is that we come, and I think there's two different ways of looking at it. We come with what a lot of professionals would call scripts, just like the script of a play. And a script of the play tells the actors what to do, what words to say, what movements to do, what attitude to express, what emotion to show, and so you play out your role. And then everyone else in the play plays out their role, and everyone does a magnificent job of their role, then the play is a wonderful success. Now, what would happen if all of a sudden a mistake was made? And you had the two key actors and actresses in this particular play. But the problem was they were giving two totally different scripts. One was given a script to this play, and the other one was given a script to a totally different play. And so they come together and they begin to play out their script. What would happen? Mass confusion. Why? Things wouldn't fit. All of a sudden I read my line and you read your line, but your line doesn't have anything to do with my line. And you go through the motions and you have the reactions that's all in your script, and all of a sudden it doesn't fit. And so all of a sudden, and eventually it would get confusing and frustrating. And a big part of it is the play would make no sense. Now, the other analogy that I like and that I've used, and a colleague of mine in another university, we were just having a conversation, and it kind of evolved, is I think it's like dancing. Because I think marriage and families are like dancing. And we kind of dance through life, And a new relationship is kind of like what happens, we don't realize it, is all of a sudden we bring our dance to this new relationship. And our partner brings their dance. And we assume that our dance is the same, that we're going to have the same motions and the same movement. But what happens early on, we begin to discover what? They're different. I'm moving one way and she's moving the other way. And all of a sudden I even begin to realize that when she moves one way, when I thought she was going to move the other way, I step on her toes. Or she steps on my toes. And we feel out of sync. And one of the issues for the adjustment to whether we're going to reach success or not, and this again is one of the real challenges, again, during young adulthood and during this early transition of forming these new intimate relationships, I believe, is about how do couples go about creating their own dance and developing a dance that works for them, and how we bring in those different movements from our dances in the families and the experiences that we've had up to this point. And that becomes the real challenge, again, for new relationships. Can we create a dance that works for us? That allows us to build compatibility. Now, what really happens, and part of it goes back to the skills. If I haven't learned the skills of effective communication, if I haven't learned the skills of being able to successfully solve problems, then to create this new dance becomes a real challenge. And here's how many couples create the new dance. Or you tell me how they create the new dance. Couples come together and all of a sudden we realize we don't share the same dance. Or that we have different scripts to a different play. Now, I think initially couples don't think that this is a real problem. Why? Can you think of why new couples might see this as a problem? And so they think that initially, because they will discover some of that. Can you think of why they might see this as not a problem at all? What? May think, and if they do, that could be real healthy. But what do you think most tend to think? All of a sudden I realize you and I are in a relationship, and all of a sudden I think you got a different dance. And what do I believe about my dance? That it's better. And it's better because it's from my perspective. Why is my dance better? If we're really honest with ourselves, what am I really thinking? It's better because it's the right dance. It's the right dance. Now, here's how it gets played out a lot of times, because a lot of times new couples don't see that as a real problem. I know my dance is better, and I know my dance is right, and most people believe that how they see life and see the world is right, and because I love you, what am I willing to do? And it'll solve the problem. Easy compatibility and adjustment. Sure. It's no problem. I love you. And it's not your fault that you don't know how to dance. It's not your fault that you grew up in the family you grew up in. So I'm more than willing to help you. And so what do? I work really hard at changing your dance. I will teach you the movements. I will tell you what you need to do, when you need to do it. And as long as you do it, what's the result? We'll be happy. Now, that tends to be about half true. Now, what are you thinking? You're thinking the same thing. All of a sudden you realize, yeah, we do have a different dance, but the problem isn't my dance, because my dance is what? What are you thinking? You're thinking your dance is right. It's what you know. It's what you're comfortable with. It's what you grew up with. You know, you watched your mom and your dad and your family, and they were happy and successful. How in the world could you say that my dance is wrong? You know, how could you possibly think that? And what you're really thinking is, you're only half right. What I need to do is what? Teach you my dance. And if you then will just do my movements the way I want them done, then we'll have no problem. And what happens a lot of times with new couples is they spend a lot of energy and a lot of time doing what? Trying to change each other. And what tends to be the outcome of that? And this is true in any part of our lives. What happens when someone tries to change us? Huh? We get defensive. We get mad. We react back to that, and we resist that, even if it might be good. You know, maybe if some part of that might be good, but we tend to resist that. And what happens, unfortunately, in a lot of couples is they find themselves working so hard at trying to change one another and then increasing the conflict that all of a sudden, if they don't have good skills, over time, begin to find those battles beginning to pull them apart instead of pull them together. If new couples will come together and understand that we're going to have different dances, we're going to have different scripts, but what we need to do is to learn to create our own dance. Learn to take movements that make sense to us. I need to learn your dance. I need to understand your dance. And maybe I'll discover that in your dance there's some wonderful movements. And you need to see that in my dance there may be some good movements. But what's most important, what movement makes sense for the two of us? And let's create a dance that works for us so that we can build compatibility. And we don't have to create a dance that's just like the dance we grew up with. We can create our own. And then that's when it works. I mean, that's when it really works. You know, and it helps when we have the skills. You know, and again, it's a lot of things that couples often don't think about in terms of building that compatibility. Real quickly, can you think of some common situations? And let's go from the simple, mundane, unimportant, to something that's really big that a couple may discover that they have a different dance. House cleaning. And a couple things about house cleaning, such as? One of the big ones is who should do what, how it should be done. Because it's interesting, a lot of times the other partner may agree to do something, but if they don't do it right, which means what most of the time? How you do it, then we still have a problem. House cleaning, big one. What are a couple of others? What are some common issues that couples have to create their dance around? Clearly parenting when children... And a lot of times it's one of those things that couples never talk about until all of a sudden we got kids. Then all of a sudden we realize, gosh, we have different viewpoints on discipline. One believes really strongly in this practice. The other one believes real strongly in you don't spank. The other one says you'd better. We got an issue. We got a real different dance here. How do we resolve it? It'd be nice to resolve it before we had the kids. What else? Jobs. Yeah, just issues around jobs and time spent around jobs and how important jobs will be. Can you think of a couple of examples of what we call the little things that happen in a married relationship that seem totally insignificant but can create a great deal of tension? It's the little habits that people have. And these are the ones that we often ignore, but actually can build into some pretty big things. Give you one example, maybe it'll stir some others. And this, we still joke about this in my family. Between my wife and I, we've been married now almost 15 years. is making the bed. I grew up, as an adolescent, coming out of adolescence, where my parents finally gave up on me having to make the bed, And so, as a teenager, I never did. My wife is someone who loves to have the bed made every morning before the day starts. It's the way her life is organized. And it's real funny, because if she goes out of town for a couple of days, I find myself right back in my old pattern. I don't make the bed. If it was just me, I probably would make it only maybe when somebody was coming to visit. Because I kind of like to get back in it just the way it is. Now, if my wife goes out of town and then right before she comes back, I then will make it so that it's kind of the way that it's supposed to be. And we work through that, something really insignificant like that. Another one in our household, we still joke about it every morning. We have now some little tricks to deal with it, is something as insignificant as where you squeeze the toothpaste. My wife squeezes in the middle. I believe in rolling from the bottom up. And we have one of these neat little devices now that you put on the end of the toothpaste. I don't know if you've ever seen those. And you just slide it up. And what's funny is we have that. But my wife will still squeeze in the middle, and then I still have to roll it up. Real quickly, can you think of a couple of other examples of the little kinds of things that couples have to learn to adjust to in order to build compatibility? The one I find the most interesting is the toilet paper roll. I'm amazed that for some people, it makes a difference on whether it is rolled over the top or underneath. And also, it's a big one whether you replace it when you empty it. What else? Just little things that couples have to deal with. And again, having not been in that situation, it's hard to think of things. But be there when you get there. Holidays, where you go, and again, you grow up in your family of where you've done it all these years, and families expect that you're going to continue to do it that way. And then all of a sudden, you've got two sets of families that are wanting the same thing, and there's no way to be in the same place, at the same time. And what you find is that there are a lot of issues, a lot more issues than you ever would have thought of. And the things that you thought were insignificant, like whether you close or don't close the cupboard doors. I don't know how many times I've hit my head coming around the corner to find that the door was open. Or I feel like I'm always closing doors. Just little different kinds of things. But again, there are these areas of, again, related to marital satisfaction, and one of the big ones is learning to create our own dance, putting together our own script so that we achieve compatibility of roles. Because when we both are in sync, when we both, agree with it doesn't matter what they are. Different couples can have different role expectations. What's important is that they're compatible for that relationship. And if they are, then they'll work. When they're incompatible, when the expectations aren't met, it creates frustration, resentment, anger, and becomes a source of conflict that can divide a relationship, over time. Last thing we want to do just very quickly is to take a look at, and to some extent we've covered this, I think there are three major reasons why relationships come to an end. And one of those, and probably the number one, is negative patterns of interactions. When couples have not developed healthy patterns, and we create patterns, we create cycles in relationships, and we tend to get things moving in a positive direction or a negative direction. And when they get moved in a negative direction, they can spiral on us, and then they can build and grow over time to where what was once positive gradually becomes more and more negative over time. And that has to do with how we communicate with our partner, whether we tend to see the positive or the negative in our partner and in our relationship. If we have the ability, as we've already said, to solve conflict, then we have healthy patterns. If we get into a negative pattern of dealing with conflict and not able to resolve conflicts, then these negative patterns over time will begin to erode the intimacy that we once had. And once we erode it so far, and it begins to lose its meaning, and the intimacy begins to fade, then people often say we drew apart, we fell out of love, or whatever happens. Part of what happens is we quit doing those things that had brought us together. And then when it loses its meaning, its level of satisfaction, then a lot of times the relationship becomes vulnerable to ending. We have to have those positive patterns of interaction. I think, unfortunately, what happens in a lot of relationships is that people fail to recognize that relationships are like most things in life. They're living. They kind of have a life of their own. And the question is whether they continue to grow after we get married or whether it moves in different directions. And I think the issue there is couples have to be intentional to always be working at the relationship. I think one of the things that happens is we tend to get married and we fall into patterns of daily living and routines, and that we begin to take the relationship and our partner for granted. Not consciously, not intentionally, but we just simply assume because we got married because we love each other that love will always be there, without realizing the love will always be there only if we are committed to working at that relationship every day and keep the love growing. Working at what brought us together will keep us together. And couples lose sight of that and will just assume that it'll always be there on its own. And they move in different directions, often without even realizing it, and then wake up one day and find they're in different places and don't know how to get back. And again, the relationship is vulnerable. And thirdly, I think one of the reasons is that people make poor choices. I don't think we do a good job of preparing people on how to select a mate that we will be compatible with. It's more than just being attracted to someone and falling in love with someone. It'd be nice if it was that simple, but it's more than that. It is a matter of being prepared for that most important decision in our lives and know how to build that compatibility. But even with all those skills, a lot of times we have this notion that opposites attract and that's what's good and that the differences is what makes us compatible. Again, a lot of times that which initially may be attractive can be a real source of irritation later on. And when we find that we've fallen in love with someone that we are very different in terms of core issues, a lot of times what couples find is they may be able to make it work, but what they find is it takes too much energy, it takes too much time, and the effort that it takes to make it work wears them out over time. When you marry the right person, someone that you truly are compatible with in those core issues, particularly the values and the beliefs, and particularly the attitudes and beliefs around roles, those kinds of things, I'm not saying it's easy, but it's a lot easier because you're not fighting that stuff all the time because you're moving in the same direction. If you're in a relationship where you're moving in opposite directions all the time, sometimes it's just too hard. And I think we need to make good choices about who we choose to be in those relationships with if we want them to be successful. Again, one of the keys, for young adults, centers around those decisions they make. Most desire to be in a successful marriage, and so it's about being prepared for that choice and decision, making good choices and decisions, and be committed to then making those things work and having the skills and the knowledge to do that. Unfortunately, we often don't do a good job of preparing people for that very important part of their lives. The next time we'll look at another important aspect of young adulthood. It impacts marriage, and it's that transition into becoming a parent and how that impacts both individual lives but marital relationships and the issue of intimacy as well.